Okay, after reviewing the green sheet and the course requirements, let me jump into the subject matter itself and provide a context for the term contemporary theater and refer to some of the social and political conditions that establish my use of the term contemporary theater. Contemporary means ideas and actions that refer to or represent the time in which they occur rather than to earlier or later times. But that's somewhat misleading because much of theater that is contemporary actually maintains practices and values of earlier times. Theater that's done today continues in many ways practices that date back many centuries, and it's as contemporary as some of the most radical innovations in theater. So we can't lose sight of contemporary theater maintaining traditions and practices that have defined theater history for long periods of time. When you use the term contemporary, there's some uncertainty about what time span that does refer to. What's contemporary in one place might not be contemporary in another place, and many ideas that seem old in one place are brand new in another place. So I'm using the term contemporary in a global perspective to indicate innovations and ideas that were new for a great many theater institutions throughout the world. So in other words, contemporary usually refers to ideas and actions that are in some way new for the society in which they occur. And I'm using contemporary to focus on innovations that occurred in theater from a global perspective in the last 30 or so years. And the emphasis is on innovations within a time period from the 1970s to the present time. How has theater changed in relation to those times since the 1970s? And how has theater been responsible for changing audiences? So in what sense has theater produced change within the audiences and societies to which it belongs? In the 1960s, the world saw large social transformations, and those transformations were the result of the post-war situation, the condition of the economy and culture and society and politics after World War II. The end of the war ushered in a period of great economic prosperity, and at the same time produced the so-called Cold War, the global conflict between the Western powers in Europe and the United States and much of the rest of the world, and the communist powers dominated by Russia and China, and the Soviet bloc nations that aligned themselves with the communist ideology after World War II and all the way up until 1990. The transformations entailed a great deal of experimentation in the 1960s. The population of the world was, at that time, young, and young people were acknowledged as a powerful economic force. They had access to resources, money, and opportunities unprecedented in the history of civilization. And governments, economies, and societies paid more attention to the desires and needs of youth at that time in the 1960s than at any time previously. The 1960s was also a time of world independence movements, as many lands that were previously under colonial rule achieved their independence after many decades of struggle. And in the United States, the civil rights movement became a major priority, along with the war on poverty and the idea that the government, in partnership with states and local communities, could dissolve all of the poverty that was widespread in the United States at the time, and provide civil rights to citizens everywhere who previously had been denied them or did not have opportunities to exercise rights that had been denied them systematically by governments and the societies in which people live. So there was a big focus on expanding the freedoms that people could enjoy and the right of nations and groups of people to independence and sovereignty. Technology also expanded considerably during that time with the production of transistors and computer chips and devices that alleviated much of the hardship that people experience in doing work and maintaining their homes and livelihoods. And a final component of social transformation was the challenge to censorship and constraints on freedom of speech, publication, and performance. So in the 1960s, a number of court cases, challenges, and movements led to the end of censorship regulations and constraints on free speech. We cannot underestimate the impact that these court decisions and movements had upon the theater and in changing the extent to which theater communicated with audiences and found new audiences. Let me describe briefly the post-war situation for theater specifically during the 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s. During those decades, theater culture was largely centralized in major cities. In the United States, New York was the capital of theater, you might say, dominated by the Broadway theater culture. New York guided the thinking about theater throughout the country. What succeeded in New York was the basis for determining what people outside of New York saw as theater. And the same could be said for other countries, where London dominated theater in England, Paris dominated theater in France, and Berlin was the theater capital of Germany. So theater culture, the 1950s and 60s, remained concentrated in major cities and dominated the theater culture elsewhere within the countries. Large syndicates controlled the theatrical talent. For example, the Schubert and Nederlander chains based in New York City controlled theaters throughout the nation. They owned these theater chains and controlled the booking. They controlled the talent and the agents who represented the talent, and they were also responsible for developing the talent through their specialized schools and a system of appointments for performance opportunities. Another feature of the centralized theater culture was the connection to the Hollywood studio. New York and Hollywood had a very close connection, whereby writing and performance talent nourished in New York City migrated to Hollywood, and Hollywood invested heavily in the Broadway theater culture, and it was very closely knit relationship between theater and the movie industry. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, theater was fundamentally author-driven, and the texts for theatrical productions dominated conceptions of theater. Theater was basically about drama, the literary text produced by an author, and theater was all about interpreting the presumed intentions of an author. All components of theater, acting, directing, design, music, dance, remain subordinate to the presumed intentions of the author or the text. All innovation in the theater was basically dependent on authors coming up with new ways of envisioning performance or action on the stage. But above all, drama and theater was focused on language, talk, dialogue, conversation as the focus of engagement for performance. Post-war audiences tended to believe that theater provided unique insight into how people use words, speech, to determine action, assert power, project identity, resolve conflicts, and manifest their desirability. So it's a very intense focus on how people are using speech, language, dialogue, interacting through words to resolve conflicts and envision solutions to world problems. Let me review some of the major dramatists of the post-war era in the United States. As I said before, theater culture was concentrated in major cities of countries, and New York City was the focus for anyone seeking a career as a dramatist and finding opportunities for the performance of plays. You just had to be in New York if you were going to have any kind of career. Broadway was the center of resources to support and nourish theatrical talent. The major critics who shaped the understanding of drama and its significance worked in New York City and wrote for newspapers and magazines that had nationwide circulation. And in New York, you had, as I mentioned previously, connections with Hollywood that otherwise you couldn't get. So let me review some of these major dramatists of the post-war era. Eugene O'Neill was a Nobel and Pulitzer Prize-winning dramatist. He died in 1953, but his achievements in drama were monumental. He thought on a big scale. No other dramatist before him had turned to the theater with such seriousness and success. And he remained the standard for achievement in drama as a result of the success he had had in theater. Dating back to 1914, the 1920s, he experimented in a wide variety of styles with expressionism, super-realism, and sometimes he introduced surrealistic kinds of effects into his plays. But his dramas were fundamentally heavy, serious, big, and time-consuming because of the slow, glacial way in which he built up intense involvement with the characters. His themes were focused on tragic, dysfunctional families, corrupted by addictions and dangerous illusions. But he was also significant in that he applied in the theater unique patterns of American speech and interaction. He, more than any other dramatist before and perhaps since, had really focused on dialects and regional ways of speaking and class distinctions in speech in a very realistic way. And he also used speech to reveal the repressed inner life of characters. Drama for O'Neill was the place where the secret life of the inner self was exposed and given some kind of image or reality that otherwise remained, as I say, repressed. Tennessee Williams, perhaps the most famous of all American dramatists, and certainly the most successful who has ever lived in the United States. He was the most revered playwright of the 1950s and 60s, and wrote, again, very serious Southern Gothic dramas of great emotional turbulence. These dramas depicted the decadence of Southern society and linked that decadence to the marginalization and oppression of persons who possessed what he called peculiar sexual desires. So his dramas dealt with themes of homosexuality and frustrated sexual desires in a way that was acceptable for the time, but also located, you might say, in a disturbed part of the United States, namely the Deep South, and audiences seem to, in New York City and elsewhere in the country, seem to appreciate that focus on highly charged sexual dramas, which nevertheless remain sort of focused on the pathologies and decadence associated with a unique sector of the United States, the Deep South. Williams had a close contact with Hollywood through such famous plays as A Streetcar Named Desire, The Glass Menagerie, The Rose Tattoo, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Sweet Bird of Youth. He had one success after another, unbelievable, and became a very powerful figure as a result of Hollywood's fascination with Tennessee Williams. Powerful dramas. Following Williams, or at the same time as Williams, Arthur Miller achieved great distinction for plays that showed how difficult it is for individuals to maintain their moral integrity in relation to corrupting social pressures. Death of a Salesman is perhaps the most famous play in American history. It's the archetypal tragedy of the 1950s, and played to this day over and over again. It never lost its appeal in dealing with the story of a salesman who's sort of a victim of the illusions of capitalism and the belief in himself that is misplaced and leads to the ruination of his family. Miller had sought to ascribe a tragic dimension to American life, and previous to him, it was doubtful that anything was tragic in American life. We were the culture and nation filled with optimism, hope, and possibility, and the idea that we might not have the capacity to accommodate all hopes and all aspirations implied a tragic dimension that American drama had not really acknowledged up until Miller's Death of a Salesman, in which he had acknowledged a tragic dimension to this everyman, this common man, Willy Loman, the salesman, who seemed so typical of American culture in ways that people accepted at that time as features of the typical American story, whereby hopes, aspirations, and dreams of a better life built around self-confidence and belief in the American entrepreneurial system do not lead to a happy ending. Edward Albee emerged in the late 1950s. He got his start actually by having his one-act plays produced first in Berlin, where he found an audience that he couldn't find in the United States. But then with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1962, he achieved everlasting stardom as a playwright. But his plays were different from Miller and Williams and O'Neill's insofar as he developed a dialogue style that indicated how intricate and highly complex speech between people was a way for them to play a kind of game with others, to dominate them. And for Albee, intricate and highly complex dialogue is a way in which people build human relations around a struggle for power. Unlike Williams, Miller, O'Neill, or any of the other playwrights who preceded him, Albee had a taste for abstraction and symbolism rather than for realism and transparency. He focused much more on using the theater, the stage, to create a world that existed only in the theater and on the stage, because we do not see this world outside of the theater. So the settings, the way people talk to each other, and the actions that unfold are unique to the theater without diminishing their connection to reality, a very skillful understanding of how theater operates. Albee was the adopted son of the owners of a theater chain in New England, and as a result he had a sort of unique understanding of how theater operates as an institution in ways that are different from other institutions. Let me conclude with a discussion of the major dramatists of the post-war era by mentioning Lorraine Hansberry, who achieved remarkable fame suddenly with one play, A Raisin in the Sun, in 1959, a realistic drama about a black family in Chicago seeking to escape the city ghetto in which they live and build a new home in a white suburb, and the obstacles they face to achieving that goal. And it's a very moving drama that had widespread resonance when it appeared on Broadway in 1959. Hansberry died shortly after the play was produced on Broadway. She suffered from cancer that cut off her career at the young age of 34. So her talent was not able to reach its full potential because of this disease. But nevertheless, this play, more than any other, revealed the extent to which this mainstream American drama that I've been talking about excluded large sectors of American life. A big controversy arose regarding this play, especially among the African American community, when one asked the question, who was the intended audience for this play, which promoted the idea of integration between races and the abolition of all of the segregationist and racist attitudes, as well as laws that prevailed in the distribution of property and the acquisition of property in the United States. The Broadway audience was overwhelmingly white for this play. And as I'll mention in later discussion, many African American writers felt that the play gave an image of African American life that was what white audiences wanted to see. Lorraine Hansberry herself believed that a different kind of play was necessary in the 1960s than the one she wrote in 1959, and herself moved into a much more experimental and indeed radical kind of theater with her last play, Les Blancs, The Whites, which remained unfinished at the time of her death.